The dust in the royal archives always fell in straight, narrow lines, as if even moats in Auracendre were expected to keep their columns. Mirelda Wynn watched a thread of dust descend in front of her nose, the shaft of pale light catching each tiny fleck. Then she blew softly, scattering the motes across the open ledger before her. The ink had dried, the entry neatly finished. Shelf B17, restricted annex, uncatalogued folio, damaged spine, probable pre-calamity origin, awaiting inspection. M.W. Probable pre-calamity, she murmured, which likely means trouble. A bell chimed somewhere above, far beyond the stone ceilings of the underground library, signaling the late afternoon hour. Most of the palace would be thinking of supper, of warm lamplight and conversation. Down here, the light was cool and steady, and any voices were kept to a whisper. Mirelda preferred the quiet. People were easier to understand when they were ink on a page. She closed the ledger and straightened, surveying the annex. It was a narrow hall, lined with shelving taller than 3 men standing on each other's shoulders, each shelf packed with volumes bound in leather, wood, or odd composites that predated the kingdom. Glass cases protected some, wax seals bound others. Runes glimmered occasionally, on spines and clasps like half-woken eyes. The folio lay where she left it, on a wheeled cart. Its spine split, its cover darkened with age and something like soot. It had turned up after a minor collapse in the far stacks that morning, a sliding of stone and wood that had sent Joran cursing for help. "Is the ceiling trying to kill us, or are the books staging a revolt?" he had grumbled when they dragged the folio from beneath a tangle of debris. "Because if the books are rebelling, I'd like advance notice so I can flee to a job that uses fewer teeth." Now the folio sat alone, looking far too innocent for something that had been hidden in a sealed wall. No title, no visible runes. Mirelda approached and pressed her fingers gently to the cover. Cold. Not the normal chill of old leather, but a biting cold that seeped into her fingertips, as if the book had been resting in snow instead of dust. She jerked her hand back on instinct, then frowned at herself. "Catalog first, worry second," she said firmly. She pulled on the thin, rune-stitched gloves hanging from her belt, standard issue in the restricted annex, and tried again. The cold still bled through, but muted now. Satisfied, she lifted the folio and turned it carefully in her hands. The spine had once been embossed with something, but the pattern was long since worn to a blur. The binding threads were unfamiliar, silvery, almost organic, with a faint metallic sheen. Not standard Auracendrian make, not from any of the neighboring kingdoms either, unless someone had taken great pains to disguise it. "Uncooperative thing," she muttered. She carried it to the nearest work table, where a lamp flickered within a glass chimney etched with protective sigils. The light turned the old leather the color of cooled embers. Mirelda set the folio down, then reached for her quill and a scrap of draft parchment. She catalogued by habit, the neat script flowing easily. Approximate dimensions, material, condition. When she reached notable qualities, she paused, then wrote, "Unusual chill. Suspected residual enchantment." The last word she wrote smaller, almost grudgingly. She did not like writing enchantment next to anything that had just fallen out of a wall. Magic was allowed here, technically, contained, studied, quarantined. She had spent years learning to read the runic matrices embedded in old texts, the way an apothecary learned to handle poisons. On the surface, Auracendre disliked to talk about magic at all. Underground, the palace employed a small army of people like her to make sure the past stayed pinned to paper and stone, where it could not burst out of history and repeat itself. "There you are." The voice made her jump. She turned to see Joran Pell leaning casually against the doorway, a stack of loose scrolls tucked beneath one arm. His hair stuck up in familiar disarray, as though he had run his hand through it a dozen times and then forgotten to smooth it back. "You shouldn't sneak up on people in the restricted annex," Mirelda said. "The wards don't like surprises." "The wards have never complained," he said.
Unlike our new assistant scribe, who has just discovered that copying century-old tax ledgers is not, in fact, the glamorous heart of archivist life. He stepped inside and set the scrolls on a nearby shelf. Then his eyes fell on the folio, and his expression sharpened. "Oh, that thing. You make it sound like it insulted your mother," Mirelda said. "It insulted my sense of self-preservation," Joran replied. "You didn't feel that beam that nearly took my head off when we pulled it free? That wasn't settling stone, Mirelda. Something snapped." "I felt it," she admitted. "That's why it's here and not on general repair. I'll log it, run the standard checks, and if there's a dormant matrix, I'll flag it for the Arcane office." Joran eyed the folio as if it might sprout teeth. "You always say standard checks as if standard means perfectly safe." "If it wasn't safe," she said calmly, "we wouldn't be alive to argue about it." He snorted, but tension eased a fraction from his shoulders. After a moment, he shrugged. "All right. I brought you the collapsed shelf records, and the princess sent down a request for the old trade treaty with Marish Vale, which I can't find, naturally. I'll go misplace more things while you make friends with forbidden objects." He turned to go, then hesitated.
"You'll ring if anything odd?" "The wards will ring first," Mirelda said, with a faint smile. "But yes, I will." He nodded and left, the door's wards flaring briefly around his body like a ripple in glass. Then she and the folio were alone again. Mirelda exhaled slowly and reached into the drawer beneath the table for the crystal prism that served as the Annex's primary diagnostic tool. It was faceted and clear, suspended from a chain of dull silver. When placed atop an enchanted object, it revealed the condition of any woven matrices: green for stable, amber for dormant, red for active, black for corrupted. She held the prism above the folio, the chain cold against her gloved fingers, and lowered it until it touched the leather cover. The crystals stayed stubbornly clear. Mirelda frowned and tapped it lightly. "Don't be difficult," she said. "I'd like to eat supper on time." Still nothing. She waited, counting to 20. Usually, even a dormant matrix gave a faint amber pulse within a few breaths. The prism remained blank and colorless, reflecting only the lamplight and the thin lines of her own face. "All right," she conceded softly. "You're either perfectly harmless or very well hidden." Procedure dictated that she not open the folio until she had logged at least a preliminary reading. Procedure had nothing to say about what to do if the prism refused to cooperate. She made a note on her draft parchment. Diagnostic prism non-responsive. Possible shielding layer. Her heart beat a little faster. Shielding layers belonged to higher-order spellwork, the kind that had helped break the world once. "Maybe you are trouble," she whispered. The proper next step would be to send for someone from the Arcane Marshal's office. Lord Renovar's people would arrive in their stiff uniforms, draw more wards, and likely whisk the folio away to be locked in a vault she would never see. Her fingers rested on the cover. If she called them, she would never know what lay inside. If she opened it herself and there was something unstable, she might not get a second chance to call anyone. Above, a second bell chimed, lower and slower, signaling the approach of evening. Soon the outer doors of the library would be barred. Wards would thicken. The annex would be sealed until morning, with Mirelda and the folio inside. Her stomach made a small, practical complaint. Supper really would be late. She closed her eyes briefly. "I will open you," she murmured to the folio, as though speaking to a skittish animal. "Carefully, briefly, and if anything looks like a calamity waiting to happen, I promise I will shut you and send for Renovar himself, smugness and all." She unlaced the thin leather ties that held the cover shut. They resisted, then gave way with a faint crackle. The cold deepened, prickling through her gloves. The lamp flame flickered. Mirelda's breath fogged slightly in the air. "That's not promising," she said, almost cheerfully, because it was either that or let nerves win. She braced her hands on either side of the folio and eased the cover open.
No explosion, no shrieking rune fire, just a soft exhale of colder air, as if the folio had been holding its breath for a very long time. The first page was not paper at all, but a thin sheet of translucent material, somewhere between glass and vellum, etched with layer upon layer of runes. They were so dense they formed spirals, lattices, almost familiar shapes that her mind refused to pin down. The language was older than anything she had catalogued, older than the kingdom, older perhaps than written history in Auracendre. Her pulse leapt. "Hello," she whispered. The runes did not reply, but something in them seemed to shift, the patterns flickering at the edge of her perception. Mirelda bent closer, careful not to touch the page. Her breath fogged again, dimming the lamplight's reflection in the translucent surface. A single rune at the center of the page flared faintly. Just a trick of the light, she thought. The lamp's wick had guttered. Her hand went automatically to the lamp controls, adjusting the flame. The light steadied. The central rune flared again, brighter this time, a point of pale blue-white that made her eyes water. Mirelda recoiled. The prism in her other hand, still dangling above the folio, gave a tiny chime. She froze and looked down. The crystal was no longer clear. Light moved inside it, not the steady glow of a stable matrix, but a swirling storm of colors. Green, gold, white, threads of shadow like distant ink. It didn't align with any diagnostic reading she'd ever learned. "Those are not official options," she breathed. The rune on the page brightened as if in answer, and the cold hit her in a rush, not just in her hands now, but in her lungs, her bones, as if the temperature of the entire annex had dropped. Wards along the walls stirred, old lines of power awakening in response. She heard them in her bones, a low hum, like the sound before thunder. "Mirelda," Joran's voice floated faintly from beyond the annex door, muffled but urgent. She tried to answer, and found her throat tight, her voice thin in her chest. "Don't come in," she managed. "Stay by the door. There's something." The rune on the page expanded, its light filling the translucent sheet like a rising tide. It did not feel hostile, she realized, some part of her mind still clear despite the rush of cold and sound. It felt purposeful, as if something had waited a very long time for someone to open this exact page. "Stop, stop, stop," Mirelda whispered, reaching for the cover. The light surged, pouring upward, through the surface of the page, through the prism, through the air itself. It struck her square in the chest.
For a moment, there was nothing but light, brilliance so intense it erased the edges of the world. She couldn't tell if she was standing or falling, couldn't feel the table beneath her hands. There was no sound except a distant, echoing tone, as if a single note had been plucked from the center of the world and left ringing. Then the light began to gather, to condense. Mirelda blinked tears from her eyes and saw it coalescing in front of her, at first just a vague column, then a more familiar outline, shoulders, arms, a torso, legs. A human shape, drawn in strokes of light and drifting runes, like ink suspended in water. Her heart did something wild in her chest. "Absolutely not," she whispered. "This is not procedure." The figure's head drew into sharper focus, features tracing themselves from the light. Not solid, not flesh, but distinct. A strong jaw, high cheekbones, a straight nose. Where eyes should have been, two pools of faintly luminescent symbols rotated slowly, like galaxies compressed behind translucent glass. The wards around the room murmured, then settled. Dust fell again from the high beams, in those same straight, tidy lines. The light figure exhaled. It was not the sound she expected, not the crackle of energy or a roar of magic, just a breath, soft and bewildered, like someone waking from a very long sleep. He swayed where he stood, as if the world were tilting under him. Mirelda realized dimly that she was still half leaning over the table, one hand on the folio, the other holding the chain of the now wildly flickering prism. Her gloves were stiff with cold. The figure's eyes, runic pools, turned toward her. The symbols shifted, rearranging themselves into something almost like pupils. They focused on her face. He blinked. "Oh," he said. His voice was a low, clear sound, warmer than she expected, with an echo of something she could not name. It filled the annex without seeming loud. "I am," he added slowly, tasting each word, "here." Mirelda's mind catalogued details at its usual brisk pace, even as something in her chest fluttered alarmingly. Height, a head taller than her. Build, lean but not gaunt, the lines of his light body suggesting muscle under some unseen skin. Appearance, man-shaped, but not a man, not human. Runes drifted across the surface of his form, rising and fading in complex patterns, more like thought than adornment. She realized she was staring. She said, "Yes, you are here." Superb eloquence, she thought mildly, some distant part of her watching herself with mild horror. The figure tilted his head. The motion was oddly precise, like someone imitating a gesture they had only ever read about. "You opened the anchor," he said. "You displaced the seal." He looked down at his own hands, flexing them. The light moved smoothly, the runes shifting like the surface of a stream. "I am unbound?" Mirelda's training scrambled for purchase. Anchors, seals, unbound constructs, spell matrices. "You," she swallowed, "you are a spell." He looked up. He seemed to consider this, then nodded once. "That is an acceptable approximation, a pattern, an intention given continuity. But there is more." His eyes, those pools of moving light, met hers again, and something like confusion flickered there. "You are not what I expected," he said softly. Mirelda's throat went dry. Likewise. The diagnostic prism slipped from her fingers. It would have shattered on the stone floor, but as it fell, a twist of light from his hand reached out instinctively, catching it mid-air. The crystal hung suspended, spinning slowly, runes inside it whirling like trapped fireflies. He frowned faintly at it, then released it. It fell the last few inches and landed on the table with a small, apologetic clink. "Apologies," he said. "Reflex." So he could manipulate physical objects. Of course he could. That's what constructs did. She just hadn't seen one do it, ever. "Mirelda!" Joran's voice again, louder this time, punctuated by a heavy thud against the door. "The wards lit up like festival lanterns. What did you do?" "Nothing," Mirelda called back, automatically. Then she winced, because that was obviously not true. "Everything is under control." The figure's head cocked again, as if listening. "Multiple heartbeats beyond the barrier," he murmured. "Agitated. Protective sigils under stress. They will breach if the matrix destabilizes further." Mirelda stared. "You can hear that?" He tapped lightly at his own chest, where a complex pattern of runes spiraled in a slow rotation, like a second internal heart. "I am linked," he said simply, "to the structure, to the wards, to the bindings that were meant to—" He broke off, his brow creasing. "Were meant to hold me." He said the last word as if he were not entirely certain he wanted it. Mirelda realized she still hadn't let go of the folio. She forced her fingers to relax, closing the cover gently. The central rune on the translucent page dimmed, though she could still feel it like a slow heartbeat under her palm. "I am Mirelda Wynn," she said, "Royal Librarian of the Restricted Annex. These are the palace archives of Auracendre. You are—" The construct paused. The runes that made up his eyes spun faster. For a moment, light flickered erratically across his form, as if 1,000 patterns were competing. Then, with visible effort, he steadied. "Caelus," he said. The words seemed to settle in the air between them, heavy with old meaning. He looked faintly surprised, as if the name had fallen into his mouth from a great height. "Caelus," she repeated, tasting the sound.
It was elegant, old. "What is your function, Caelus?" Something shifted behind his expression, a shadow crossing the luminous lines of his features. He looked down at his hands again, fingers curling as if around invisible threads. "I do not know," he admitted quietly. "The core directive is blurred, fractured. I recall a web, stabilization protocols, containment arrays, the scent of char in the air, voices shouting, then unbeing, silence, until—" He looked up at her, and the light in his eyes warmed. "You." Mirelda felt that flutter in her chest again, sharper this time. It was the archivist's thrill at a new discovery, she told herself, nothing more. "You were sealed in this folio," she said, choosing each word carefully. "However long ago that was. The Calamity era, perhaps. The records from that time are fragmentary at best. You may be very old." He frowned. Runes along his forearms rearranged themselves, forming patterns she associated with calculation, timekeeping, celestial arcs. After a moment, he shook his head. "Temporal markers degraded," he said. "The local field has shifted significantly. I cannot determine exact duration." He paused, then added with wry puzzlement, "Older than you, certainly." Despite the situation, Mirelda's lips twitched. "Yes," she said, "that seems likely." The wards along the door pulsed again, a deeper surge. The lamplight flickered, shadows twisting. Caelus's form blurred at the edges, as if the room's very structure were pulling at him. He took a step closer to the table, bracing his luminous hands on the wood. The runes around his core heart flare spun faster. "Your warding lattice is not built to support a construct of my scale," he said. "The bindings are trying to decide whether I am hostile. They will err on the side of safety. That is unwise." "In terms of property damage?" Mirelda asked, forcing her voice to stay level, even as she tracked every fluctuation in his light. "Or lives?" He considered. "Both." "Right." She inhaled slowly, drawing air into lungs that had forgotten how to breathe evenly. "We need to calm them, and we need to get the Arcane office here before they think the Annex has become a hazard and shut us behind a containment seal." "Containment," Caelus repeated, and his face shuttered briefly. "Yes, they would like that." He did not sound afraid so much as resigned. "Do you—" she hesitated. "Do you wish to be contained?" He looked at her, startled. The runes along his collarbone flickered in what she suspected was the magical equivalent of a skipped heartbeat. "I wish," he said slowly, as if the verb itself were unfamiliar, "not to fracture, not to unmake what stands, not to hurt." His gaze dipped to her hands, to the way she held the folio, steady despite the trembling of the lamplight.
"I do not yet know if that requires me to vanish." Mirelda's throat tightened. "You haven't hurt anything," she said softly. "Not yet." "Not yet," he echoed, a comfort and a warning. The wards surged again, and this time a hairline crack skated across one of the glass cases on the far wall. Books within rustled as if in complaint. Joran shouted something indistinct beyond the door, his fist hitting the wood with a dull thud. "Time is collapsing," Caelus said, more calmly than she thought the situation warranted. "You must choose. Alert the external regulators now, or attempt to stabilize me yourself before they arrive." "The rational choice is the first one," Mirelda said.
She could already hear Lord Renevar's voice in her mind. "You were trained to observe, Wynn, not to intervene. Artifacts are secured by specialists, not bookkeepers." Her fingers tightened on the folio. She imagined Renevar's teams arriving. Their ward collars, their rune snares, the way they would look at Caelus, not as a sentient construct, but as a resource, a threat, something to be dismantled in a controlled environment, its pieces catalogued and never seen again. He must have read some flicker of that thought in her face, because his expression shifted. Curiosity. Then a small, sad understanding. "It is not your function to defend me," he said gently. "Your function is preservation of knowledge. If I am a danger to this structure, to your people, the logical action is to discard the unstable element." "You are not a book," she said sharply, surprising herself. "You're—" She stopped. What exactly was he? A pattern? An intention? A relic from an age of disasters? A potential calamity? A person-shaped spell who spoke with warmth and confusion, and who, moments after awakening into a strange world, worried about hurting it. "You're not just an unstable element," she finished more quietly. He smiled faintly, a quick flash of light softening his features. It changed him, that smile, made him look less like a sculpture of runes and more like someone she could imagine standing in a sunlit courtyard, arguing over the proper shelving of travelogues. "It is kind of you to say so," he murmured. The crack in the glass case widened. A book slipped and landed with a dull thump. Mirelda inhaled through her nose, letting the tang of dust and old paper steady her. "All right," she said, "we do both. I signal the outer wards that the situation is contained under Annex Protocol, buy us time before Renevar panics. And in that time, we try to stabilize you. Enough that you won't bring the ceiling down if someone glares at you." "And how," Caelus asked politely, "do you intend to adjust a spellwork of my complexity with only your hands and familiarity with cataloging systems?" "Don't mock cataloging systems," she said over the faint tremor in her voice. "They're very powerful." He made a sound that might have been a laugh. It rippled through the room like a softer echo of the earlier surge, but this time the wards seemed to relax, just a fraction. The lamplight steadied. Mirelda crossed to the wall panel that housed the annex ward controls, a copper inlay etched with runes. Her gloved fingers danced over them, pressing a sequence she'd learned in the first week of her post. "Annex anomaly active. Librarian on duty. Do not breach without clearance." A faint chime answered, echoing through the stone. The pressure on the wards at the door eased. Joran's next curse was more bewildered than afraid. She turned back to Caelus. "First," she said briskly, because if she did not treat this like a problem of misshelved manuscripts, she might think too much about the fact that reality was threatening to unravel in her workspace, "we determine what makes you worse and what makes you better. You said the wards are not built for you. Are they pressing against you, or are you pressing against them?" "Both," he said, his runic eyes unfocused slightly, as if looking at something far away. "The lattice is probing, searching for classification. I am feeding back, unconsciously. Systems built to restrain simple flows of power, not this." "Can you stop feeding back?" she asked. "Pull inward? Think smaller?" He frowned, then closed his eyes. The runes along his outer edges dimmed, contracting toward his core. His outline softened, his height shrinking by a handspan. The crack in the glass halted its slow creep. "There," Mirelda breathed. "Better." Caelus opened his eyes. He looked tired, which was ridiculous because spells did not tire. And yet something in the set of his shoulders, the dimmer glow of his heart runes, suggested strain. "Contraction is possible," he said, "sustainable for a short period. It increases internal pressure. Again that wry, almost humor. I will not explode, probably.
"You're doing very well for someone who's existed as a book for centuries," she said. "I have known people with far more time on 2 legs who handle stress much worse." He inclined his head, accepting the compliment as if it were a formal thing. "Thank you, Mistress Wynn." The title jolted her. "Hold. Just Mirelda," she said, more sharply than she intended. "I'm not a mistress of anything. I look after other people's mistakes." "And now," he said, meeting her gaze with unnerving directness, "you have awakened one." The words should have stung. Instead, they settled over her like a cloak that unexpectedly fit her shoulders. "I don't yet know if you are a mistake," she said. "You might be an unfinished task, a mislaid solution." "A mislaid solution," he repeated slowly. "I like that better." A knock, more tentative this time, came from the door. Joran's voice, closer now that the wards were less volatile. "Mirelda, the ward panel just told me Annex anomaly contained under Librarian protocol, which is either reassuring or terrifying. Are you going to open this door, or should I start writing my will?" Mirelda glanced at Caelus. "If I open the door, will that make things worse?" she asked quietly. He considered, eyes half-lidded, listening again to currents she could not sense. After a moment, he shook his head. "No. The presence of additional minds may complicate political outcomes, but the structural matrix is stable enough, if I remain compact." She nodded once and crossed to the door. Her hand hovered over the release rune. "Please don't do anything dramatic," she muttered to the room in general. She touched the rune. The door's wards shimmered and parted. The heavy wood swung inward a handspan. Joran's face appeared in the gap, pale and wide-eyed. "There you are," he said. "Did you know the entire south corridor lit up? The princess herself sent a runner down to ask if we'd accidentally summoned the calamity back for an encore." His gaze slid past her, into the annex, and landed on Caelus. The rest of his sentence dissolved into a strangled noise. Mirelda stepped slightly aside, instinctively positioning herself between Joran and the glowing construct, even though Caelus was taller than either of them and obviously made of concentrated magic. "Joran Pell," she said, with forced calm. "May I introduce Caelus? He is—" "A spell," Joran whispered. His eyes were huge. "That's a man. Made of script and bad decisions?" "Accurate," Caelus murmured, tilting his head politely. "Greetings. I apologize for any distress my awakening has caused." Joran opened and closed his mouth twice, like a fish caught unexpectedly in shallow water. Mirelda reached out and touched his sleeve lightly. "He's unstable," she said softly, "but not hostile. The wards are negotiating with him. I need you to go to the princess. Tell her we have an awakened construct in the annex, and that I request a private audience before Lord Renovar is informed." Joran tore his gaze away from Caelus with visible effort. "Before Renovar? Mirelda, he'll have my head for even knowing before him, let alone delaying." "Joran." She rarely used his name like that, sharp and steady. He blinked. "Please, the princess trusts you. She trusts me. If Renovar hears sentient spell before she does, we will lose any chance at a measured response. We need time. Not much. Just an hour." "An hour?" Joran squeaked. "With that?" He pointed helplessly at Caelus, who watched this all with the patient curiosity of a scholar observing a lively debate. Mirelda lowered her voice further. "I wouldn't ask if it weren't important," she said, "and I wouldn't keep him here if I thought anyone was in danger. Go, tell Alanara that if she ever wished for a chance to reshape how Auracendre treats magic, this is it." Joran stared at her, then at Caelus, then back at her. "You're serious?" he whispered. "Yes," she said. He swallowed. Then he nodded, the motion jerky but determined. "An hour," he said. "If the ceiling falls in on you, I'm never forgiving you." "Understandable," she said. He looked once more at Caelus, made a strangled sound that might have been "pleasure to meet you," and fled, the door closing with a soft thud behind him. Silence settled in the annex again, heavy but not as oppressive as before. Caelus exhaled, a sound that still fascinated her, coming from a being without lungs. "You place much trust in him," he observed. "I do," she said simply. "And in this Princess Alanara?" "I hope I'm right to," Mirelda replied. "We'll find out." Caelus regarded her for a moment. The runes around his eyes shifted, softening. "You are very composed," he said, "for someone who has just broken a centuries-old seal and unleashed an unknown construct of considerable power in a confined space." "Composed is a generous word," Mirelda said. "Internally, I am cataloging my mistakes in order of how much trouble they will cause." "And where, in this catalog, does my awakening fall?" She met his gaze. "I don't know yet," she admitted. "That depends on what we do with you." "What you do with me," he corrected gently. "I am not currently in a position to make choices that will be respected by your structures, I suspect." "Then we'll make room for them," she said. The words surprised her, even as they left her mouth. She had never thought of herself as someone who made room for anything beyond books and the people who came to read them. Caelus's expression, for a moment, was simply open, grateful. It did something peculiar to her chest, that look. She focused instead on his outlines, on the way his light still wavered at the edges. "We have an hour," she said briskly. "Less if Renovar is particularly offended. In that time we need to ensure that you do not inadvertently tear any more cracks in the walls." "A reasonable goal," he said. "Can you sit?" she asked. "Perch on the table, perhaps? The more grounded you are, the easier it is for the wards to triangulate your position." He nodded and moved to sit on the edge of the work table. The wood creaked faintly under his weight, as if unsure whether it was in fact bearing anything substantial. "We have an hour," she said briskly. "Less if Renovar is particularly offended. In that time we need to ensure that you do not inadvertently tear any more cracks in the walls." "A reasonable goal," he said. "Can you sit?" she asked. "Perch on the table, perhaps? The more grounded you are, the easier it is for the wards to triangulate your position." He nodded and moved to sit on the edge of the work table. The wood creaked faintly under his weight, as if unsure whether it was in fact bearing anything substantial. Light from his form spilled across the scattered pages, turning her notes into silhouettes. "I have never sat before," he remarked, sounding faintly amused. "I find I enjoy it." "I'm very happy for you," Mirelda said dryly, though she was unexpectedly. "Now, tell me everything you remember of your creation, every word, every sensation, even if it seems unimportant. Archivists are very fond of things other people consider unimportant." He nodded, his gaze growing distant again. "As you wish," he said. "I recall a circle, not of stone, but of light. Voices, fear." As he spoke, the runes along his hands began to move in new patterns she did not recognize, tracing faint shapes in the air. Not strong enough to trigger the wards, but visible, like the ghost of script. Mirelda pulled a fresh sheet of parchment toward her and dipped her quill. Her hand trembled only once. She began to write. Hours ago, this had been an ordinary day. Misfiled trade treaties, collapsed shelves, dust drifting in polite lines. Now she sat across from a living spell, who had spoken her name as if it were the first anchor he'd been offered in centuries. Above, the bells of Auracendre tolled the evening hour. Down here, in the quiet between wards and stone, something new had stepped into the world. Mirelda did not know yet whether she had made a terrible mistake. But as Caelus's voice wove through the annex, and she caught glimpses in his words of a world half lost to history, she found, against her better judgment, the faintest stirrings of something that felt dangerously like hope. The annex felt warmer the next morning, though the lamps still burned with their usual pale steadiness. Mirelda suspected the warmth had more to do with the shimmering figure sitting quietly near the far table than with any change in the airflow. Caelus had spent the night in a kind of meditative stillness, the runes of his form dimmed to a soft glow. She had spent the night on a narrow cot in her tiny archivist quarters, far above the restricted annex, thinking of him. At dawn she returned, half expecting the annex to be shattered or sealed, half expecting Caelus to have unraveled back into the folios pages. But he was still there, solid in his own way, though the air around him shimmered with faint distortions, like heat haze. "Mirelda," he said, the moment she entered, rising from the table as though he were greeting visiting royalty. He said her name with such deliberate clarity that it made something warm start in her throat. "You didn't destabilize," she said, more relief in her voice than she meant. "I tried not to," Caelus replied, with earnest gravity. "You instructed me to remain compact. I remained compact." "You did very well," she said. He brightened slightly, literally, runic light flickering through the lines of his arms. She walked past him toward the ward panel, checking the night's logs. No breaches, no collapses, no red alerts. Only a few amber pulses marking fluctuations around Caelus's presence. "I'd say that's a quiet night," she murmured. "Does that please you?" he asked. She turned. "Yes, it does." The runes in his eyes softened. Before she could say more, footsteps echoed beyond the annex door. Then the wards rippled, recognizing a permitted presence. Princess Alanara entered with Joran at her heels. Alanara always carried an air of calm authority, but today there was tension threading her posture. Her auburn hair was bound in braids, and she wore a simple slate-blue gown, practical, understated, but marked with the royal sigils that allowed her to traverse warded spaces freely. "Mirelda," she began quietly, "Joran gave me an interesting report." "That might be the politest way to phrase it," Joran muttered. Caelus straightened, luminous shoulders drawing back. Light rippled over him like a held breath. Alanara froze mid-step. Mirelda stepped quickly between them. "Princess, this is Caelus. He is—" "A spell," Alanara finished softly, eyes widening. "A living spell." Caelus lowered his head in what looked like a respectful bow. "Your Highness, apologies for my unexpected presence." "You speak," she said faintly. "Only recently," Caelus answered. "Thanks to Mirelda." The princess's gaze darted between them, taking in the steady posture of Caelus, the intact annex, and the utter lack of destruction. "No hostility? No surges? No containment breaches?" "He's been cooperative," Mirelda said, "and he's anchored for now." Joran leaned toward her and whispered loudly, "Your definition of anchored is very generous." "Joran," she hissed. Alanara exhaled slowly, regaining her composure. "I came as soon as I could. Renovar is already preparing inspectors, but for the moment he does not know the nature of the disturbance." Mirelda nodded. "We need time before he intervenes." "I suspected that," the princess said. Her gaze fell on Caelus again. "May I speak with you directly?" Caelus inclined his head. "I am present." Alanara approached slowly, cautious but unafraid. "What do you know of your origin?" "Little," Caelus admitted. A circle of light, voices, urgency, then silence, until Mirelda opened the anchor. "You are aware of yourself?" she murmured. "Sentient?" "I believe so." "And do you pose harm to Auracendre?" He hesitated. Not long, but long enough for Mirelda's heart to stutter. "I do not wish to," Caelus said. "That's not what I asked." His light flickered uneasily.
Unanchored, I risk destabilization. If I am removed from Mirelda's proximity, or if aggression is directed at me, I could fracture.
That might harm structures, people. But I am trying not to. Mirelda stepped forward. He can be stabilized further. I just need more time to understand his matrices. And Renovar will not allow time, Alanara murmured. Joran rubbed his temples. He's already smiling like a man who can see promotions on the horizon. The princess folded her hands. For now, this stays between us. I'll delay Renovar as long as possible, but you need answers, quickly. We've begun, Mirelda said. She gestured to the notes she'd compiled, pages of diagrams, fragmented runic extrapolations, theories written in her crisp script. Caelus has been recalling pieces of his creation. It's slow, but a faint tremor ran through Caelus, and the air shimmered around him. Mirelda immediately stepped closer. Caelus, focus, contract. He closed his eyes. His form shrank, runes pulling tighter. The tremor eased. Alanara's brows lifted. You can calm him? He responds to proximity, Mirelda said. It's not precise, yet. Caelus opened his eyes again. I am trying, he murmured. You're doing fine, Mirelda said gently. Something passed across Caelus's face. Something almost like wonder. Alanara noticed, but was too tactful to comment. You said unanchored spells can destabilize. What anchors you now? Caelus turned toward Mirelda. She does. Mirelda felt heat rise to her cheeks. Temporarily, until we identify a permanent structure or purpose. Joran choked. Purpose? We need to give the magic man made of light a purpose? Caelus considered this. I would like one. The princess nodded gravely. Then find it, before Renovar finds you. She placed her hand briefly on Mirelda's arm, warm, grounding, then exited with a rustle of skirts. Joran hurried after her, shooting Caelus a final wide-eyed look before the door sealed behind them. The annex fell silent again. Mirelda turned to Caelus, who sat back on the table, shoulders dimming slightly as tension eased. You handled that well, she said. I did not unravel, Caelus said. This was my success. It was more than that, she said softly. He tilted his head. Why do you say such things to me? Because they're true. He looked away, but the runes across his cheek flickered in a pattern she was beginning to recognize. Embarrassment, or perhaps shyness. Mirelda gathered her papers. We need to continue. Tell me more about the voices you remember. You said fear. Whose fear? Caelus went still. Many voices, he said. Some shouting, some chanting, some crying. They spoke a language I half understand. They said the world was breaking, that they needed... His hands tightened, light warped around them. Caelus, she said quietly, breathe. I have no lungs, he whispered. You do a very convincing impression of breathing. Try that. A faint smile tugged at his mouth. He inhaled, a gesture, a mimicry, but it steadied the rippling runes along his arms. The voices said they needed a continuity anchor, he murmured, something to hold magic steady. Mirelda's breath caught. Then you were created after the calamity began, not before. He nodded. Yes, I think I was meant to help. Her quill hovered above the parchment. You weren't a weapon. I do not know. His voice was hollow with uncertainty. Intention can shift. Constructs can be altered. But not without leaving traces in the runes, she said. And I haven't seen any sign of weapon matrices in your structure. You see my structure? He murmured. That should not be possible. You are human, untrained. I'm trained in reading, she corrected. Patterns, scripts. Runes are just a more stubborn form of writing. He stared at her, expression softening. You are unexpected. So are you, she said. A warm silence filled the annex. Then Caelus shifted, light rippling along his shoulders. I want to understand this world, he said quietly. Your world. It is different from the fragments I remember. She braced her hands on the table, leaning slightly closer. What do you want to know? He blinked, and the runes in his eyes expanded like widening stars. Everything. She laughed, surprising herself. The sound echoed off the stone. All right, we'll start with something small. She spent the next hour explaining Auracendre, its laws, its fears, its long distrust of magic. Caelus listened with a level of focus that made her hyper-aware of every word she chose, as though each syllable carved itself directly into his understanding. He asked questions, simple ones, profound ones, questions that made her see her own world with fresh eyes. When she explained that books preserved knowledge so people would not forget the past, he said softly, "Then I am a book, and you are reading me." The words lodged somewhere deep inside her. "So I am," she said. He seemed pleased by that. At one point, she poured herself tea from the annex kettle. Caelus watched the steam rise, fascinated. "It is warm," he observed. "You place your hands near it without fear." "It's a harmless kind of warm," she said. "Not like you." He hesitated. "Am I frightening to you?" The question was plain, vulnerable. She lowered her teacup. "You unsettle me," she admitted, "but not because you're dangerous." He waited. "You unsettle me because you're—" She searched for a safe word. "New." That was true, and incomplete. Caelus seemed to consider this deeply. "You are new to me as well, yet I find this pleasant." Her cheeks warmed again. "We should get back to the runes." "Yes," he said immediately, though the runes in his eyes flickered warmly. "Of course." Hours passed in gentle rhythm. Caelus recalling fragments, Mirelda mapping them, the two of them working in wordless harmony punctuated by quiet conversation. Occasionally he asked about mundane things, why humans slept, what tea tasted like, what it meant to be tired. Once he asked, "Why do you touch the parchment so gently?" "Because these pages are delicate," she said. "They've survived centuries. Care is the least they deserve." He fell quiet, watching her with an unreadable expression. By late afternoon, she had a clearer picture of his origins. Caelus had been meant to stabilize magic by absorbing destructive fluctuations and redistributing them safely, a living equilibrium. But he had never been fully activated. The ritual that created him had been interrupted. He had been sealed while incomplete, left to sleep through centuries. "No wonder you're unstable," she murmured. "You're unfinished." Caelus looked down at his hands. "Unfinished," he repeated, softly. "Is that a flaw?" "It's a condition," she said gently, "not a condemnation." His gaze lifted to hers. The runes in his eyes glowed faintly, as though warmed. Then the annex wards pulsed violently. Mirelda jolted upright. "What?" Caelus stiffened. His entire form flickered, runes scattering for a moment before reassembling. Someone is approaching, aggressively, pushing through the ward passage. A sharp knock rattled the door. "Mirelda Wynn," a familiar voice barked. "Open this door immediately." Lord Renevar. Mirelda's heart thudded. He wasn't supposed to know yet. "He feels entitled to everything," Caelus murmured dryly, which under other circumstances might have made her laugh. Light flared unpredictably through his form. "Caelus," she whispered, "hold together." He tried. She saw it in every controlled breath-like motion, in every ripple of runes pulling inward. But Renevar hammered at the door again, and the wards arced violently. "Mirelda!" Renevar thundered. "I will break this door down if you do not comply." Caelus's form distorted, edges blurring, runes flickering in chaotic spirals. Fear surged up her spine. "Caelus," she said urgently, stepping closer. "Look at me." His luminous eyes snapped to hers, but he was trembling now, light sparking at the seams of his shape. "Focus on me," she said. "Not the door, not the wards, me." He reached toward her, hesitantly, carefully,
and she did something she had not planned. She took his hand. Or rather, what passed for his hand. It was warm, impossibly soft, like holding captured starlight. The moment their palms met, the tremors eased. The distortion around him calmed. The runes stilled.
Caelus inhaled sharply in that imitation of breath. "I am anchored," he whispered. "Yes," she said firmly, "you are." Renovar banged the door again. "Mirelda Wynn, in the name of the Arcane Council!" Mirelda didn't look away from Caelus. "You stay steady," she whispered. "I'll handle him." She let go of Caelus's hand with care, though her fingers tingled with the lingering warmth. Then she turned toward the door, and for the first time since awakening Caelus, she realized she was no longer afraid of what she had brought into the world. She was afraid of losing him. Mirelda drew a steadying breath and strode to the door. The wards simmered under Renovar's pounding, light rippling across the wood like heat on metal. She laid her gloved hand on the control rune and murmured the override sequence. The door seals sighed, loosening with reluctance. The door flew inward before she could open it fully. Lord Varric Renovar filled the threshold in dark uniform and sharper temper, his cloak snapping behind him. 2 warders stood at his back, palms already glowing with contained sigils. The Arcane Marshal's gaze swept the annex once, taking in the crack in the glass case, the active ward lines, the faint twist in the air around Caelus. Then his eyes narrowed. "Mirelda Wynn," he said, voice low and dangerous. "You will explain why the entire South Quadrant registered a high-order surge last night and again this afternoon, without a single notice filed to my office." Mirelda inclined her head. "Lord Renovar, the disturbance is contained." "By a librarian," he said. "Not by my warders, not by sanctioned arcanists. A librarian." Behind her, Caelus remained seated on the table, compacted as tightly as he could manage, luminous hands folded. He was very still, but she could feel him, like a taut wire at the edge of her awareness. The wards felt him too. They pulsed intermittently, undecided. Renovar's gaze snapped to him. "What," he said slowly, "is that?" Mirelda forced herself to speak calmly. "An awakened construct, my lord. I discovered a sealed grimoire during the shelf collapse. When I opened it under Annex Protocol, this construct emerged." "You opened it?" His tone could have frozen fire. "Without alerting my office? Without supervision?" "Diagnostic measures suggested a shielded matrix, not an active one," she said. "Once the construct awakened, calling warders into an unstable environment would have worsened the reaction. I stabilized him as best I could and notified Princess Alinara." The warders exchanged glances. Renovar's jaw clenched. "You bypassed the arcane office to inform the crown?" he said. "This annex serves the royal archives," she replied. "The princess has oversight." His mouth thinned. He stepped past her, striding into the room as if he owned the stone itself.
The wards crackled at his passage. Caelus did not rise, but his light flickered. His eyes followed Renovar's movements with careful stillness. Renovar stopped before the table and looked Caelus over as one might examine an unfamiliar weapon. "Designation," he said curtly. "Caelus," the construct answered. Its voice startled the warders. One muttered a quick charm under his breath. Renovar's eyes narrowed. "Class." "Continuity construct," Caelus replied. Mirelda's heart jolted. They had only just pieced that together from fragments. To hear Caelus state it so plainly. "Continuity," Renovar repeated skeptically. "What continuity?" Caelus's gaze drifted past him, unfocused for a moment as he listened inward. "I was designed to mitigate catastrophic magical fluctuations," he said slowly. "To absorb,
redistribute, smooth, to preserve structures. Renovar folded his arms. A stabilizer, a living regulator. His tone turned almost hungry. An artifact from the calamity, buried under my wards for centuries, and no one in my office knew. Your office didn't dig out the folio, Mirelda said, more sharply than she intended. He ignored her. How stable are you now, Caelus? Caelus's light dimmed a fraction. I am incomplete, he said. My activation was interrupted. My matrices are fractured. Without an anchor, I will destabilize. And your current anchor? Renovar asked, though his eyes had already shifted toward Mirelda. Caelus's gaze followed. Mirelda. The warders tensed. Renovar turned back to her, lips curling. How cozy. Proximity to me calms the surges, she said evenly. I didn't plan it. Of course you didn't. He paced a tight semicircle, boots ringing on stone. An incomplete continuity construct, sentient, unpredictable, bound to an archivist. His eyes gleamed with a kind of cold calculation that made her skin prickle. It belongs in containment, he said, under my control. Caelus's fingers tightened on the table's edge. The wards quivered. Containment will trigger his destabilization, Mirelda said quickly. He responds poorly to threats. Anxiety spikes his output, which aggravates the wards, which— I am well aware how feedback works, Renovar snapped. Unlike you, I have spent my life handling volatile matrices. You have overstepped, Wynn. One of the warders stepped forward. My lord, shall we deploy a suppression lattice? Caelus's form shuddered. The air shimmered around him, a warning wave. No, Mirelda said, that will— Enough, Renovar cut in. You've meddled enough. He raised his hand, runes flaring across his palm, forming the first strokes of a binding pattern. Mirelda. Caelus spoke her name like a plea. She moved without thinking, crossing the space between them and putting herself between Renovar's hand and Caelus's chest. The binding sigil halted an inch from her shoulder, light sputtering. Renovar stared at her. Are you out of your mind? Stop, she said quietly. Please. He lowered his hand only a fraction. You obstruct an official binding, on a high-risk construct, in an active disturbance zone. You will make it worse, she insisted. He's not attacking. He's frightened. A frightened construct is more dangerous, not less. He is aware, she said. He doesn't want to harm anyone. He is a spell, Renovar said, each word bitten off. It doesn't matter what he wants. It matters what he can do. Caelus's voice came softly from behind her. If you bind me to a suppression lattice, he said, I will fracture. The warders shifted uneasily. One swallowed. Renovar's eyes flicked between them, calculating again. And if I leave you unbound, you will, what, attempt to self-regulate? Hope your fondness for a librarian keeps you from collapsing the palace? Yes, Caelus said. Mirelda shot him an incredulous look. He blinked. Was that not the desired answer? A strangled noise escaped one of the warders. Mirelda wasn't sure if it was horror or laughter. Lord Renovar, she said, forcing herself to calm, to argue like a scholar, not a panicked accomplice. He has stabilized significantly in the last day. If we can complete his directive instead of smothering it, he could reinforce the city's warding lattice permanently. Imagine outer districts protected as well as the palace. The calamity's echoes softened. That's worth a measured approach. What you propose, Renovar said flatly, is that we trust an unfinished, self-aware artifact with the kingdom's safety because you find him compelling in dim archive lighting? The words struck harder than she expected. She ignored the heat in her cheeks. "What I propose," she said, "is that we use what he was built for instead of triggering what he was sealed to prevent." Renervar regarded her for a long, thin moment. Finally, he lowered his hand. "You have until sunset," he said. "What?" "You claim you can stabilize him. Prove it, by sunset." His gaze flicked to Caelus. "After that, he goes into containment, willingly or not. If you interfere again, I will have you removed from your post and charged with obstruction of arcane security." The threat hung in the air like a blade. Mirelda swallowed. "Sunset," she repeated softly. Renervar gestured sharply to his warders. "Leave a monitor rune at the annex door. Nothing leaves without my knowledge." He stepped closer to Caelus, lowering his voice. "If you harm anyone, construct, that librarian will be the first consequence." Caelus's light dimmed. "I do not." Renervar turned on his heel and strode out, warders following. The door sealed behind them with a hiss of wards re-engaging. A small, dark sigil etched itself into the stone above the frame, pulsing faintly. The monitor rune. Silence crashed down. Mirelda realized her hands were shaking. Caelus's light reached toward her, hesitated, then withdrew. "I am sorry," he murmured. "My existence complicates yours." "Existing tends to do that," she said weakly, then snorted at herself. "Sunset. He gives me until sunset and expects miracles." "Sunset," Caelus echoed. "A span of hours to complete what was interrupted centuries ago." She looked up at him. "You're surprisingly calm about this." "I was built in haste during a catastrophe. Time pressure is familiar." He tried for levity. It almost worked. Her lips twitched before the weight of his words sank in. "If this fails," she whispered, "they'll tear you apart." He studied her face, runes in his eyes turning soft. "If this fails, I will likely unravel regardless. Tell me, Mirelda, would you prefer strangers dismantle me, or that I fade on my own terms, having tried to help?" She hated that he spoke of himself like that, like an object, a project, a ticking problem. She hated that he was right about the options. "We are not reaching either of those outcomes," she said. "An optimistic assertion," he observed. "A librarian's assertion," she corrected. "We don't misplace important volumes." His light warmed, the closest thing he had to a smile. "Very well. What is your plan?" "Plan?" she muttered. "Yes, I have one. Half of one." She paced to the folio, flipping it open carefully. The translucent activation page glowed faintly under her touch. The central rune that had birthed Caelus pulsed like a sleeping eye. "We know you were anchored to this originally," she said. "A ritual circle, a grimoire, a purpose. Something went wrong. You were sealed mid-creation. The only way to stabilize you now is to finish what they started." Caelus moved to stand beside her, his presence turning the page's runes brighter. "You intend to complete the ritual?" he said. "In this environment? With incomplete instructions?" "Yes." "That seems dangerous." "Yes." His gaze slid to her. "You do not care?" "Of course I care," she snapped. "I just care more about not handing you to Renervar in pieces." He went quiet at that. She traced a finger above the runes, careful not to touch. "You said you remember the circle, the phrases, the structure of your core directives. If we map what you recall onto what's written here, we might reconstruct enough of the ritual to redefine your purpose." "Redefine," he repeated. She nodded. "They designed you to stabilize the aftermath of one specific catastrophe. That world is gone. Auracendre changed. The magic changed. You're trying to hold steady a pattern that no longer exists. No wonder you're at risk of tearing." "You propose," he said slowly, "to give me a new directive.
Yes, one that fits now instead of then. Something smaller, local, aligned with what we know you are. A continuity construct, he murmured. What continuity would you assign me? She didn't answer immediately. The prospect of inscribing such a thing felt intimate, like naming a child, or making a promise she had no right to make. Later, she said, first we need to know if a redefinition ritual is even possible with what we have. They worked. The hours between midday and sunset stretched, thinned, and frayed. The annex became a cocoon of whispers and light, scribbled diagrams and half-remembered incantations. Caelus walked her through the circle he had known in that other time, positions of casters, flows of energy, the pattern of fear and hope in their voices. Fear and hope are not technical parameters, she pointed out once, exasperated. They mattered, he insisted. I could feel the difference when their fear overwhelmed their faith. The matrix stuttered. She noted that down too as best she could. Emotional intent as stabilizing factor. At some point she realized she was hungry. At another, that she wasn't sure whether the bell she heard was for the 4th or 5th hour. Time blurred into runes and murmurs. When her hand began to cramp, Caelus noticed. You are straining your body, he said. You should rest. Can't, she muttered. Sunset. He stepped behind her, his presence a warmth at her back without heat. May I assist? How? She asked, still writing. If you will permit contact, he said carefully, I can steady the fine muscles in your hand, ease the tremor. You are, in a sense, a matrix of flesh. I understand matrices. She huffed a startled laugh. You're comparing me to a scroll? To a very elaborate scroll, he amended. She hesitated only a moment before nodding. All right, try. His light hand gently enclosed hers, not fully touching, more like a sheath of warmth around her fingers. The tremble in her grip eased, the pain in her knuckles dulled. The quill moved smoother, her letters steadying as though she'd slept. She exhaled. That's uncanny, she said. I am very good at my intended function, he replied, when I know what it is. Their joined hands moved across the parchment, her motion, his support. The sensation of writing with him like that was strange, but not unpleasant. It felt, in some deep place, like collaboration in the purest sense. She offered direction, he offered stability. After a while she became too aware of the warmth at her back and cleared her throat. That's enough, she murmured. He immediately withdrew, light folding tidily away. Have I overstepped? No, she said quickly, just too effective. I might start expecting help every time I have to copy dry legal codices. That sounds dreadful, he said gravely. It is. He smiled. They bent again over the folio and her notes, standing shoulder to shoulder now, close enough that she could feel the hum of his presence, like a quiet song under her skin. Mirelda? He asked, some time later, when the page of reconstructed runes was nearly filled. Yes? Why? He hesitated, searching for words. Why are you doing this for me? She blinked. Because you'll unravel otherwise. That is reason enough to try, he said, but not reason enough to defy your superiors, risk your position, risk yourself. She stared at the page. I told you, she said eventually. Archivists are fond of things other people consider unimportant. You aren't unimportant. You never should have been abandoned in a wall. You were built to help. You deserve a chance to try. That is generous, he murmured. It's practical, she said. If you stabilize, you could help us repair what the calamity broke. And if I do not, he said quietly, you will have wasted your career on a failed experiment. She finally looked up at him. His luminous eyes reflected her face, tiny and pale and stubborn. I'll have wasted it trying to save something that was worth saving, she said. That is not a waste. The runes along his chest brightened, flaring in a pattern she hadn't seen before, something like astonishment threaded with a kind of fragile joy. You value me, he said, as if naming an impossible thing. Of course I do, she said. I'm a librarian. I'm constitutionally incapable of not valuing rare things. He laughed softly. Outside, a bell tolled, the note deeper, longer. The sky beyond the narrow high window had shifted to amber. Sunset, he said. Not yet, she whispered. Not quite. They had enough of the ritual now to try something, perhaps not the full redefinition, but a smaller test. Mirelda constructed a miniature circle on the table, using quill ink and chalk. An outer ring of runes matching those in the folio, an inner ring of her own additions, bridging old directives to new. In theory, she said, this will redirect a small fraction of your output into a controlled channel. If you can hold it, we know larger redirections are possible. And if I cannot, he asked. She grimaced. Then parts of the annex will be scuffed. I will attempt not to scuff your workplace, he said solemnly. He stepped into the circle, careful not to blur the chalk lines, and stood at its center. Light rippled across him, reacting to the runes as if to a remembered language. Mirelda took her position at the edge, hand hovering above the anchor sigil she'd drawn for herself. Remember, she said, no forcing.
Just allow a little of your internal strain to bleed into the pattern, like exhaling. I am very good at exhaling now, he said. You insisted. Don't make jokes during experimental spell work, she said, lips twitching. It's bad form. He closed his eyes. She activated the circle. The runes flared, first in her chalk lines, then in the ink, then reaching for the patterns in Caelus's form. Light flowed along the pathways she'd drawn, tentative at first, then stronger, as if a river had found an old cleared channel. For a heartbeat, everything held. Then a fissure sliced through her carefully drawn bridge runes, jagged as lightning. The channel twisted, light surged sideways. The nearest shelf shuddered. A flurry of loose pages burst from an open book, spiraling through the air like startled birds. The lamp over the table flared, glass chiming violently. A hairline crack zipped across the floor. "Stop!" Mirelda cried. The circle collapsed. The light she'd redirected snapped back into Caelus with a sharp, audible crack. He staggered, knees hitting the stone, hands catching him at the last moment. His form flickered wildly. She dropped to her knees beside him. "Caelus," she said, breathless. I'm sorry. I misaligned the... Are you... He raised his head. His light was pale, but steadying. The runes in his eyes refocused. "I am... intact," he said, "and I have learned something." "What?" He nodded toward the fractured chalk circle. "Your pattern tried to impose a directive without fully integrating my existing matrices. There was a rejection, a misfit, like forcing a script into the wrong grammar." "Of course," she whispered. "I treated you like a simple spell. You're not. You're a person," he said quietly. She hesitated. "Yes." The words seemed to settle between them like a stone in water, ripples expanding outward. "A person," he repeated, tasting it. "Can you rewrite a person's purpose?" "No," she said, "not like that. And not without their consent." "Consent," he murmured. "Agreement. Choice." He looked at her, runes in his eyes shining with sudden clarity. "Mirelda," he said, "what if the problem is not that my original directive is wrong, but that it is incomplete? That I lack a secondary anchor, a narrower tether, something to know not just what I was built for, but what I choose?" "You're suggesting," she said slowly, "a dual anchor framework, original purpose plus chosen purpose." He nodded. "One to the world, one to something smaller. Someone smaller." Her heart beat harder. "And who," she asked softly, "would you choose?" His gaze did not waver. "You," he said. The single syllable was not a declaration, not really. It was a simple statement of fact, spoken with the same quiet certainty he used for runes and matrices, and it struck her harder than any spell. "That's She swallowed. Caelus, anchoring yourself to a person is dangerous. I am dangerous regardless, he said. At least this way, I choose the shape of the danger. She wanted to argue. She knew all the reasons it was risky. People died. People changed. People disappointed. I am an archivist, she said, almost desperately. Not a mage, not a hero. You opened the folio, he replied. You argued with your Arcane Marshal. You are mapping a lost ritual between bells. You are not what your title suggests. Her throat tightened. Outside, the sunset bell began to toll, the sound reverberating through stone. Caelus shifted closer, the air between them charged with something fragile and bright. If I must anchor to someone, he murmured, let it be the one who believed I was more than a problem to be solved. You don't know what you're asking, she whispered. Then explain it to me, he said. Teach me. You are very good at that. The bell tolled again. In that ringing silence between notes, Mirelda realized that the choice was not truly his alone. A dual anchor required 2 points. If she agreed, if she stepped into the ritual as his chosen purpose, she would be bound too, at least in some subtle way. Her emotions, her presence, her decisions would affect his stability. He would be her responsibility. Her partner, in a sense. A living spell whose heart would take shape around her. She had spent her life shelving other people's stories, keeping a tidy distance from anything that might tangle hers. Now, a being of light and runes was offering to tether himself to her, not as a weapon, but as a guardian, whose existence would revolve, in part, around the promise she made tonight. Mirelda. He said her name with such quiet trust that it undid the last knots of her resistance. She closed her eyes. You understand, she said, that this will not be servitude. If we do this, it's partnership. You will not owe me obedience, only connection. His voice, when it came, was roughened by something she had not heard from him before, emotion that strained the edges of his control. I do not want a master, he said. I want a center, a place from which to act. If you will be that, if you will let me be near you, I will protect what you protect, learn what you teach, balance what I can. Her eyes stung. Very well, she said. She drew a breath that felt like stepping off a cliff. Let's redefine you. They reset the circle, this time not as an experiment, but as a beginning. Mirelda adjusted the runes, weaving into the outer ring the full continuity directive Caelus described, and inside it a smaller ring of symbols that meant, in the old language and the new, chosen anchor, shared purpose, mutual consent. In the center, she left a space for a symbol that had no written form yet. Caelus stood inside the circle again, light steady. Mirelda faced him from the edge. Once we begin, he said quietly, we may not be able to stop halfway. I know, she said. Are you afraid? He asked. Yes, she answered, very much. I am too, he murmured. A faint smile touched his lips. We match. She held out her hand. He looked at it as if it were a miraculous artifact, then reached out and took it. Warmth rushed through her arm again, but this time it was not just magic. It was trust, laid across her palm like a vow. She activated the circle. Light flared, not explosive, but encompassing. The runes around them lit one by one, old symbols finding their voices after centuries of silence. The folio's anchor page glowed in sympathy, its central rune pulsing. Caelus's form brightened, not in a chaotic surge this time, but in a rising, controlled radiance. Power flowed from him into the circle, and from the circle into the world, and from the world back into him, tracing new paths Mirelda had helped draw. The dual anchor pattern engaged. She felt it when it found purchase. A thread fine as spider silk stretched between his core and her chest, settling somewhere just behind her sternum. It did not burn, it did not bind her like a chain. It simply existed, humming in tune with her heartbeat. Caelus gasped, not an imitation now, but a genuine sound of shock. "Mirelda," he whispered, "you—" "I'm here," she said through gritted teeth. The sensation was strange, overwhelming. She could feel his instability, the tremors at the edges of his being, but she could also feel the way they eased when he focused on her. "Look at me," she said again, as she had at the door. "Stay with me." He did. The runes in his eyes swirled, then locked onto her gaze. The circle's light swelled, then narrowed, tightening around them like a ring. "State your chosen purpose," she said, voice steadier than she felt. He hesitated only a heartbeat. "To preserve balance," he said. "To protect this place, these people. To guard the one who woke me." The words etched themselves into the air, into the runes at his core, into the circle itself, into her. The dual anchor locked. For a moment there was nothing but shared light. Then, slowly, the radiance receded, settling back into his form, into the chalk lines, into the world. The circle went dark. Mirelda sagged, knees nearly giving way. Caelus caught her with both hands, his grip firm, his touch no longer trembling. He was solid. Not flesh, not human, but steady. His edges no longer wavered. The wards around the annex quieted to a low, contented hum. He looked down at her, and for the first time since he had appeared in a burst of light and runes, she saw no fractures in his glow. "Mirelda," he said softly, "you anchored me." She felt the thread between them, a gentle, relentless presence. "We anchored each other," she corrected, breathless. Outside, the last notes of the sunset bell faded into evening. Inside the annex, where dust usually fell in neat, indifferent lines, a living spell and a very tired librarian stood in the quiet aftermath of a decision that had changed both their fates. Night settled over Auracendre like a velvet shroud, softening the edges of rooftops and towers above. Deep below, in the wards of the restricted annex, the only light came from the lamps, and from Caelus, who glowed with a steadiness Mirelda had not yet seen in him. But stability did not mean safety. They both felt it, the thin, taut thread binding them, humming quietly beneath their ribs. A shared presence, not overwhelming, but unmistakable. "We need to verify," Mirelda said, rubbing the strain from her eyes. "Make sure nothing warped. Make sure you're not leaking arcane pressure." "A concerning phrase," Caelus murmured. "You know what I mean." He nodded and raised one hand, examining the runes along his palm. They flowed in a smooth, controlled rhythm, no flickering, no fractures. "I feel centered," he said, "as though the world is no longer shifting beneath my feet." "That's good," she said. "That's very good." But worry clung to her voice. Caelus noticed. "You are afraid," he said gently. She hesitated. "Not of you. Of Renavar. And of what happens next," she admitted. "He gave us until sunset, and now sunset has passed. He'll return, and he won't believe what we've done is enough." Caelus's light dimmed thoughtfully. "Do you regret anchoring to me?" Her breath caught. She hadn't expected the question. "No," she said, too fast, too honest. "I don't." Caelus's runes warmed. Relief, gratitude, something she refused to name. There was a knock. A firm, commanding knock that rattled the wards. Mirelda's stomach plummeted. Caelus stepped in front of her, light flaring briefly, not in aggression, but in instinctive protectiveness. The thread between them thrummed. "Mirelda Wynn," Renavar's voice thundered through the wood. "Open this door, now." She steadied herself. "We knew this was coming." "Yes," Caelus said softly, "but I hoped he might be delayed." "So did I." She approached the door, fingers brushing the release rune. Caelus stayed close behind her, closer than before,
But she didn't tell him to move away. She opened the door. Renovar entered like a storm, 2 senior warders flanking him.
The monitor rune above the entrance flared red, reacting to heightened tensions. Renovar wasted no time. "Do you have results, Wynn?" he demanded, "because your hour has passed." "I do," she said, level. Caelus stepped into view. Renovar froze. The warders stiffened. The wards around the annex did not shudder or dim. They remained steady, accepting Caelus's presence for the first time since his awakening. Mirelda gestured, "See for yourself." Renovar stared at Caelus. "Your instability is gone." "Yes," Caelus said. "How?" Renovar's eyes narrowed. "What did you do, Wynn?" "We completed the directive," Mirelda said. "A reconstruction of the activation ritual, adapted to modern conditions." "That is impossible," he snapped. "No human alive knows high-order calamity ritual matrices." "Not entirely," she agreed, "but Caelus remembered pieces. I deciphered the runes. We created a dual anchor." Renovar's expression turned sharp and ugly. "Explain." Caelus spoke before she could. "I am still a continuity construct," he said, "but I am anchored now, both to the world's stabilizing threads and to a person." Renovar's brows shot up. "A person? Who?" Caelus turned slightly, light shifting. "Mirelda." The warders recoiled. Renovar's face paled, then flushed with fury. "You anchored a volatile construct to yourself?" he hissed. "Are you mad?" "No," Mirelda said. "I'm practical. He needed a purpose that fits this era, not one frozen in an age of catastrophe." "His purpose," Renovar growled, "is to be contained, studied, controlled." "He's not a weapon," she said. "He is whatever the Council decides," Renovar snapped. Caelus stepped forward, not threateningly, but firmly. "I am aware of myself," he said quietly. "I have no intention of being dismantled." "You don't get intentions," Renovar spat. "You are a spell." "Then treat me as one," Caelus answered, "and know this. Suppressing me now will destabilize the ritual and cause exactly the destruction you fear." That gave even Renovar cause. The Arcane Marshal looked again at Mirelda, eyes narrowing dangerously. "You presume," he said softly, "that the crown will side with you." "She already knows," Mirelda said. "Princess Alinara was informed earlier today." Renovar's face twisted. "She does not have the authority to countermand a containment order." "She has the authority to petition the Council," Mirelda replied calmly. "And she will," Caelus added, "because she sees possibilities where you see threats." Renovar snapped. "Enough." He raised one hand. A binding lattice burst to life above his palm, violent, angular, a net of razor-edged runes. Mirelda's blood chilled. "Renovar," she warned, "if you do that, you will stand aside," he barked, "or I will remove you." Caelus moved instantly, light flaring, runes tightening across his form. The wards trembled, the air thickened with tension. Mirelda stepped between them before she knew she'd moved. "Don't," she said fiercely, "neither of you." The thread between her and Caelus pulsed, tightening. Caelus froze, reacting instinctively to her distress. His light softened, contracting. Renovar seized the moment. "You see?" he said, triumph curling in his tone. "He obeys you." "No," Mirelda snapped. "He listens to me. That's different." "You think this is partnership?" Renovar growled. "But it's a leash, and it makes him more dangerous, not less." Mirelda opened her mouth to argue. But Caelus suddenly stiffened. "Mirelda," he whispered, "something is wrong." "What?" He didn't answer. His runes flickered erratically, once, twice. Then the floor beneath their feet vibrated. Renovar's warders looked around in alarm. "My lord, secondary wards are surging." A low hum rippled through the annex. The shelves trembled. Dust sifted down. Caelus's light shuddered. No, Mirelda breathed. Why? You're anchored. You're stable. Caelus's voice came strained, as if through static. External pressure. The binding lattice in Renovar's hand. It's reacting. It's trying to override my core. Mirelda spun toward Renovar. Drop the lattice. He didn't move. Fear tactic. He's manipulating you. The shelf nearest them cracked down the spine. Books leapt from it as though shoved by invisible hands. Caelus fell to one knee. Mirelda, he gasped. I am slipping. Help me. Her heart clenched. She dropped beside him, grasping both his hands. The moment she touched him, the thread flared like a struck cord. His light steadied, but only barely. His form rippled like barely contained water. You're fighting the override, she whispered. Yes, he strained, but the ritual was too recent, too delicate. He didn't finish. His eyes shattered into wild spirals of runes. Thunder cracked inside the annex. Renovar stumbled back, warders raising shields. Caelus cried out, not in pain, but in something deeper, something like terror. His body flickered, dimmed, surged, split along fracturing lines of light. Runes tore loose from his surface, spiraling into the air like embers sucked upward by a storm. Mirelda's breath stuttered. Caelus, look at me. Focus. Anchor. His hand slipped through hers, half-formed, dissolving. I can't. Too many. Pulling. She grabbed him harder. You told me to anchor you, she said fiercely. Then let me. Renovar's voice rose behind them. Step away, Wynn. He's destabilizing. Be silent, Mirelda snapped. Lightning cracked through the archive as Caelus's form contorted. One moment he was there, the next he was dissolving into fragments of light. Mirelda, he whispered, voice thin. I'm sorry. I can't hold. No, she said, breath breaking. You hold on. Look at me. Don't look anywhere else. Another tremor shook the annex. A sigil on the far wall split with a bang. One of the warders shouted for backup. Caelus's light shrank to a flickering core. Mirelda, his voice was fading. Thank you for trying. Terror knifed through her. No, she whispered. No, no, you don't get to go. Not like this. She braced both hands on his collapsing form and drew in a breath that cut like ice. Then she did the only thing she could think of. She opened herself to the anchor. Not cautiously, not carefully, completely. The thread between them snapped taut. A flood of light rushed through her chest, searing cold and brilliant warmth all at once. Her vision blurred with runes. Her heartbeat stuttered and then synced to something older, deeper. Caelus inhaled sharply, not a mimicry, a real, shuddering intake of breath. His form halted mid-collapse. Mirelda, he gasped. What are you? Trust me, she whispered, as I trusted you. His runes flickered violently, then steadied in a new pattern, one she recognized. Dual anchoring. Reinforced. Mutual. He reached for her hands, not instinctively, not reflexively, but deliberately, and clasped them. Light surged between them like a rising tide, filling every crack in his fracturing matrices. A shock wave rolled outward, rattling shelves, shattering Renovar's binding lattice. The Arcane Marshal staggered, shouting something Mirelda couldn't hear. Caelus's form re-solidified, slowly, painfully, but undeniably. When the light receded, he was kneeling, both hands still wrapped around hers, chest heaving with some instinctive mimicry of breath. He looked at himself, stunned. I am here. And then he looked at her. Mirelda, what have you done? She exhaled, shaking. Anchored you, she said, voice raw, fully this time. His light softened around the edges. You risked too much. I calculated the risk, she said, with a shaky smile. Very poorly, but I did calculate. He let out a sound that was half laugh, half wonder. Behind them, Renovar regained his footing. His face was livid. "What have you done?" he roared. "What have you done?" Mirelda rose slowly, Caelus rising beside her like a second shadow of light. "We stabilized him," she said calmly. "You're welcome." Renovar stared, trembling with fury. "This is treasonous arcane interference." "You've bonded a sentient construct to yourself, without sanction, without oversight, without—" "Yes," she said simply. Renovar sputtered. "The council will hear of this. You'll be stripped of your post, imprisoned, banished." Caelus stepped forward, light sharpening, not threatening, but unmistakably protective. "You will not harm her," he said quietly. Renovar's warders scrambled back, shields brightening. "Stand down," Renovar barked at Caelus. "You are bound to her, not vice versa." For the first time, Caelus smiled with something like certainty. "Incorrect." His light brightened, not in a surge, but in a steady, controlled radiance. "I am bound with her," he said. "Not beneath, not above." Mirelda felt the truth of it through the anchor thread, steadfast, resonant. Renovar shook with fury. "The council will never allow this. Never!" "Then they will learn," Mirelda said, "or they will break against their own stubbornness. Either way, Caelus stays." The annex fell silent. Renovar stared at her, rage simmering, but something else creeping into his expression. Fear. Not of Caelus, of what this meant. "Very well," he said at last, voice low. "Have it your way, Wynn. Enjoy the consequences." He stormed out, warders in tow, leaving the annex trembling in his wake. When the door sealed, Mirelda let out a long, shaking breath. Her knees nearly buckled, but Caelus caught her, steadying her gently. "You should rest," he murmured. She looked at him, at the soft steadiness of his light, the runes that no longer flickered, the way he watched her with an emotion she could not yet name. "I can't," she said. "Not yet." "Why?" he asked softly. "Because tomorrow," she whispered, "the entire kingdom will know what we've done." Caelus nodded. "And we will face it," he said. "Together." Mirelda met his luminous gaze, and for the first time since awakening him, she felt neither fear nor doubt, only certainty. Together. Whatever came next, they would face it as one. The next morning arrived with a quiet that felt almost unreal. Mirelda sat on the low stone bench outside the annex, the familiar scent of parchment and mineral dust drifting around her. The palace above was already stirring, footsteps echoing across marble, voices carrying through stairwells, the distant clang of the morning bell. Today the council would convene. Today the kingdom would learn the truth. Her stomach tightened, but she kept her spine straight. She had slept for only a few hours, yet she felt steady, anchored, she realized, with a faint, involuntary smile. The thread between her heart and Caelus's pulsed gently. He stood beside her, observing the early light filtering down the stairwell. He was quieter than usual, not withdrawn, but contemplative. His form glowed less brightly than last night, but not from instability. It was a controlled softness, like a lamp turned low out of respect for morning. "You're thinking very loudly," he said softly. She blinked. "Is that a problem?" "No," he said. "It's comforting." He sat beside her, mirroring her posture exactly, as if he was learning how one waits for fate to unfold. "I am surprised," he murmured. "By what?" "By how calm you are." She exhaled. "Terrified is happening underneath. Calm is the surface layer I display to avoid collapsing." He considered this carefully. Humans are composed of many contradictory layers. Most of us are, you included. He tilted his head, runes shifting gently. "Contradictory?" "You're composed of both light and fear," she said, "both strength and uncertainty. It makes you real." A soft pulse moved through him, the anchor thread responding. Then, in an unexpected moment of honesty, he said, "I am afraid they will take you away from me." She swallowed. "They won't. You cannot promise that." "No," she admitted, "but I can promise that they'll have a harder time than they think." She stood, smoothing her robes. "Princess Alanara asked to meet before the session. We should go." Caelus rose fluidly, as if he weighed no more than a beam of light. "I will follow." She paused, staring at him. "You don't have to follow," she said gently. "You walk with me." His expression warmed, a ripple of gold coursing through the runes in his eyes. "Then I will." They walked through the palace corridors toward the council chamber. Servants froze in their tracks at the sight of Caelus, some bowing instinctively, others staring in awe or fear. Word had already spread. Whispers followed them like trailing smoke. "Is that him? The living spell. The librarian anchored it." Caelus's steps grew quieter, lighter. His form flickered in discomfort. Mirelda brushed her fingers against the back of his light coalesced hand. He didn't need the contact to stay stable, but he needed it to stay grounded. He steadied instantly. Princess Alanara waited at the council chamber doors, dressed not in silks, but in a formal uniform, deep navy with silver trim, signaling she was acting in full state authority. "Thank the skies," she whispered when she saw them. "I've been fending off Renevar's petitions all morning." "Has he told them everything?" Mirelda asked. "Not everything," Alanara said. "Only the sensational parts, the dangerous parts, the parts that frighten the council before they can think straight." Mirelda grimaced. "That sounds like him." Alanara approached Caelus, studying him with a soft but steady gaze. "How do you feel?" "Awake," Caelus said. "Aligned." "And possessing an abundance of concern." "That is understandable," Alanara replied warmly. "But you won't be alone in there." She turned to Mirelda. "Are you ready?" "No," Mirelda said truthfully, "but I'm going anyway." Alanara's smile was small but approving. "Good." The doors opened. The high council chamber was vast, tiered seats rising around a circular floor. Every member was present. At the center stood Renevar, hands clasped behind his back, posture victoriously rigid. "There," he said loudly, gesturing toward Caelus, "the rogue construct and his handler." Mirelda bristled. Caelus's light dimmed defensively. "Marshal Renevar," Alanara said sharply, "you will not use that tone in this chamber." "It's a threat," Renevar barked. "Anchored to a civilian, you cannot possibly allow." "Enough," said Councillor Branthos, the eldest and most respected of the council. His voice cut the room cleanly. "We will hear facts, not fear." He turned to Mirelda. "Librarian Wynn, approach." Mirelda stepped forward. Her heart thundered, but her voice, when she spoke, did not waver. "Honored Council, I awakened Caelus by accident, but everything after that was choice." Soft murmurs rose. She continued, "I observed that he was sentient, aware, and frightened, like any citizen would be after waking in a strange world." Councillor Thalon scoffed. "Citizens are made of flesh, not magic shaped by bygone sorcerers." Mirelda looked at Caelus, whose runes pulsed softly. "Perhaps that's a difference in construction, not in worth." The murmur grew louder. She lifted her chin. "Through collaboration, Caelus and I completed the activation ritual that was interrupted centuries ago. He is now stable, self-aware, and capable of serving his intended function, the preservation of magical balance." Councillor Branthos turned to Caelus. "Construct Caelus, do you speak as she claims?" Caelus stepped forward, light steady. "I do." His voice filled the chamber with quiet resonance. "I was created as a continuity construct, but never finished. Mirelda Wynn helped me complete that process. She did not bind me into obedience. She anchored me so I might choose my purpose with clarity." "And your chosen purpose?" Branthos asked. Caelus looked at Caelus, then back to the council. "To preserve balance," he said, "to protect this kingdom, and to safeguard the one who awakened me." A few councillors shifted uncomfortably. Renevar seized the moment. "And you find this reassuring?" he demanded.
He is tied emotionally and magically to a single librarian who has neither training nor authority to command such a force? No one commands me, Caelus said, a thread of steel in his voice. I do not obey, I cooperate. That caused an entire row of counselors to sit straighter.
And if Mirelda Wynn were harmed? Renovar pushed. How would you react then? Caelus considered. Mirelda's heart froze, but Caelus's reply was calm. I would grieve, he said, not destroy. The answer was unexpected, disarming half the chamber. Renovar stuttered. You expect us to believe? No one will harm her, Caelus said softly, not while I remain. That was not a threat, it was a vow, and everyone felt the difference. The council chambers grew still. Finally, Councillor Branthos asked, Princess Alinara, your position. Alinara stepped forward with perfect composure. Auracendre has feared magic since the calamity, she said, but fear without reason is stagnation. Caelus offers stabilization we cannot reproduce. Mirelda Wynn offers a bridge to understanding him. Her gaze swept the room. Destroying Caelus wastes a miracle. Imprisoning Mirelda punishes wisdom. I advise integration, not fear. Silence. Then, slowly, Councillor Branthos nodded. The Council rules, he declared, that Construct Caelus is to be recognized as a sentient magical entity under Crown supervision. He shall assist the Arcane Office in stabilizing wards throughout Auracendre. Librarian Mirelda Wynn shall serve as his liaison and advisor. Renovar sputtered. This is decided, Branthos said firmly. The gavel struck. A unified breath left the room. Relief, disbelief, a shifting tide. Mirelda felt faint. She turned to Caelus. He was glowing softly, not in danger, but in something like joy. We did it, she whispered. We did, he murmured. Together. Alinara stepped beside them, smiling. History will remember this day, Mirelda. I'd prefer it didn't, Mirelda muttered. Attention is terribly inconvenient. Caelus tilted his head. You will receive much of it. Yes, she sighed, defeated. I gathered. As the chamber emptied, Caelus extended a hand toward her again, not because he needed stabilization, but because he wanted connection. She placed her hand in his. The anchor thread hummed peacefully. Where do we go now? She asked softly. Wherever you wish, Caelus replied. I will walk with you. She smiled, warmth blooming under her ribs. Let's start with the archives, she said. They'll be a disaster from last night. He brightened. Then we shall repair them. And after that? He paused, then spoke with quiet certainty. After that, we build a future, one that belongs to us both. Mirelda felt her throat tighten. Yes, she whispered, I'd like that. They walked out of the council chamber side by side, a librarian and a living spell, bound by trust, purpose, and a steady thread of light that neither feared any longer. Whatever came next, they would face it together.